In the Arizona Territory during June of 1912, a heat wave had descended upon the Sonoran floor like a thick, smothering quilt. For 3 straight weeks, the mercury refused to dip below 90 degrees, even in the deepest hours of the night. By day, it soared beyond 115, a brutal and unyielding assault that evaporated creeks, left livestock to perish in the fields, and pushed the local inhabitants to the very edge of their endurance. Most families were taking the only sensible course of action. They were nailing boards over their windows, drenching bedsheets in precious water, or escaping to the cooler, higher altitudes of Flagstaff to get away from the furnace-like conditions. Yet, on a patch of arid scrub just beyond the town's edge, a single man was engaged in an act that seemed like pure self-destruction. He wasn't running. He wasn't taking cover. He was constructing something, and what he was raising from the earth filled his neighbors with dread. Connected to a small, stoutly walled stone cabin was a tower. It climbed 25 feet into the shimmering atmosphere, fashioned from crude masonry and clay. The height itself wasn't the issue. The real problem was its color. As the sun beat down with a ferocity that could blister exposed skin in moments, this man was perched on a ladder, methodically painting the entire chimney-like structure a profound, non-reflective black. To the townspeople observing from the cool shade of their verandas, it was a monument to insanity. It was common knowledge that in the desert, you paint everything white. You bounce the sun's rays away. You seek refuge from the heat. By coating a massive stone surface in black, he was fashioning a solar sponge, purposefully inviting the sun to bake that stone until it was hot enough to cook on. They murmured amongst themselves that the heat would bleed into his cabin, transforming his home into a kiln. They dubbed him the Baker of Pinal County, certain he was building his own tomb. But when the heat wave reached its zenith in July, and the town's doctor was overwhelmed with cases of heat stroke, a concerned neighbor finally ventured out to check on the madman. He anticipated discovering a body, or at the very least, a man in the throes of thermal delirium. What he found instead was the man sitting calmly in his cabin, clad in a long-sleeved shirt, sipping hot coffee. The air inside wasn't merely tolerable, it was cool. A constant, noiseless draft was flowing through the room, chilling the sweat on the visitor's skin. The neighbors scanned the room for a fan, a block of ice, or anything that could account for the chill. There was nothing. Only the man, the cabin, and that black tower baking under the sun. The builder regarded his bewildered neighbor and clarified the contradiction that had preserved his life. The so-called experts believed the sun was the adversary. He, however, knew the sun was the power source. The hotter his black tower became, the more rapidly the air moved, and the cooler his room grew. This was not some form of magic. It was a lost command of fluid dynamics and thermodynamics that harnessed the brutal Arizona sun, turning it into a gigantic, silent vacuum pump. To grasp why this black tower was an act of genius, one must first comprehend the unique and deadly mechanics of the high desert. The danger in the Sonoran isn't limited to air temperature. It is the solar gain. The sun bombards the earth with extraordinary energy, saturating every surface it touches. In 1912, the conventional wisdom for building in this climate was proving to be a failure. The settlers had imported construction techniques from the East Coast and the Midwest, resulting in wood-frame shacks with flimsy walls and pitched roofs. In a more moderate climate, these designs are adequate. In the desert, they become death traps. Wood possesses almost no thermal mass, offering negligible resistance to the transfer of heat. When the sun strikes a wooden wall at 10 in the morning, that heat is inside the house by 5 past 10. By midday, the interior of such a structure is frequently hotter than the outside air, as poor ventilation traps the heat within. The alternative was the more traditional adobe or stone cabin. These performed better, but they contained a critical weakness during an extended heat wave. Adobe functions on the principle of thermal mass, thick walls that soak up heat during the day and radiate it out at night. This system works flawlessly if the temperature falls substantially after sunset, which allows the walls to reset by discharging their stored heat. But in June of 1912, the temperatures were not dropping. The nights remained oppressively hot. This led to a condition known as thermal saturation. The thick walls absorbed heat all day long, but since the night air was still 90 degrees, they had no way to release it. By the third day of the heat wave, the walls ceased to be a shield and instead became a radiator. Their thermal mass was completely full. They started to radiate heat into the living space around the clock. The cabin transformed into a brick oven. The very walls intended to safeguard the inhabitants were now slowly cooking them. The human toll of this architectural miscalculation was immense. Sleep became an impossibility. Lacking air conditioning, the body depends on the evaporation of sweat to cool itself, a process that necessitates airflow. But inside these stagnant, heat-soaked boxes, the air was utterly still. Food spoilage quickened, milk soured in a matter of hours, and meat in less than a day. The desperation grew so intense that entire families would desert their homes after dark, hauling mattresses into the yard to sleep beneath the stars. They exchanged the security of walls for the minimal comfort of open air, leaving themselves vulnerable to scorpions, rattlesnakes, and the incessant dust. The local contractors and self-proclaimed experts maintained that the answer was straightforward: shade and ventilation. They promoted wide porches, tall ceilings, and cross breezes. Yet, when the outside air is 115 degrees, a cross breeze is merely a blast from a furnace. Pushing hot air across a hot body does not cool you down if that air is warmer than your skin. It only accelerates dehydration. They were attempting to combat the sun with passive resistance, hiding beneath eaves and hoping for a cloud. The man with the black tower approached the problem from a different angle. He understood that fighting the sun with shade was a losing proposition. The sun's energy was simply too powerful. You could never block it all. But what if you didn't try to block it? What if you harnessed it instead? He viewed the solar radiation not as a foe to be deflected, but as a wellspring of kinetic energy. He knew that heat creates expansion, and expansion creates movement. If he could manage that movement, he could manage the temperature. While his neighbors were trying to halt the heat, he was constructing a machine to speed it up. He didn't require shade. He required a draft. And to generate the most powerful draft imaginable, he needed the hottest fire he could find. He looked up at the midday sun and saw the fuel for his engine. The man standing on that ladder was not a mason, nor was he a conventional home builder. He was a mining engineer. And in the early 20th century, mining engineers grasped something about air that architects did not. When you are 2,000 feet below the surface, ventilation is not a question of comfort. It is a question of survival. In the deep copper mines, still air meant the buildup of lethal gases and suffocating heat. Before electricity introduced powerful fans to the mines, engineers moved air by using fire. They would construct a furnace at the base of a ventilation shaft. The fire heated the air, the hot air surged up the shaft, and that rising column produced a powerful suction that drew fresh, cool air down into the mine from the surface. He didn't see a house. He saw a mine shaft in reverse. He realized he could apply the very same principles of physics to his living space, but instead of burning coal to generate the updraft, he would burn sunlight. This forms the central principle of the solar chimney, or what engineers refer to as the stack effect. It is based on a fundamental law of fluid dynamics: buoyancy. When air is heated, its molecules vibrate with greater energy and spread apart. The air becomes less dense than the cooler air that surrounds it. It grows lighter. And because it is lighter, it doesn't simply float upward. It is actively forced upward by the heavier, cooler air attempting to occupy its space. This generates a vertical current, a thermal siphon that moves with surprising velocity. The larger the temperature difference, the delta T, between the air inside the chimney and the air outside, the faster the current flows. This was the reason the tower had to be black. The neighbors believed the black paint was an error, a method for absorbing heat into the building's structure. They were only partially correct. He did want to absorb heat, but not into the thermal mass of the cabin's walls. He needed to absorb it specifically into the column of air inside the chimney. The black basalt and dark clay were intended to function as a solar collector, a combustion chamber without a flame. By isolating this column of air and exposing it to the greatest possible solar radiation, he could superheat the air within the stack to 140 or 150 degrees Fahrenheit, significantly hotter than the ambient air outside. This superheated air would rocket up the 25-foot tower, desperate to get out. And this is where his engineering brilliance set him apart from the amateurs. Most people conceive of ventilation as pushing air into a room. He was thinking about pulling air out. As that column of hot air blasted out the top of the chimney, it left a vacuum in its wake. It established a zone of low pressure at the base of the stack. The chimney was, in effect, a vacuum pump. It was a massive, silent engine powered by the very thing that was afflicting everyone else. The sun was the fuel, the chimney was the piston, and the air was the working fluid. The hotter the sun beat down upon that black tower, the harder the engine worked. The pressure differential would increase, and the house would essentially try to collapse inward, desperately seeking air to fill the void created by the chimney. But a vacuum is worthless if it's filled with the wrong thing. Had he just opened his windows like his neighbors, the low pressure in the cabin would have drawn in the 115-degree air from outside. He would have created a wind tunnel of fire. The crucial insight, the piece of the puzzle that made the entire system function, was that a vacuum gives you the power to select your air source. If you seal the house as tight as a drum, closing every window, plugging every crack, shutting every door, you compel the vacuum to draw from the only opening that remains. You get to choose where the replacement air originates. And he knew that while the air at head level was scorching, the air deep beneath his feet had never been touched by the sun. He didn't just build upward, he also dug downward. While the town watched the black tower rise with disbelief, they had failed to notice the weeks of grueling labor that came before it. He had used the cooler spring months to excavate a trench through the hard-packed caliche soil, extending 150 feet away from his cabin. It resembled a drainage ditch, or perhaps a line for sewage, cutting through the scrub brush. But he wasn't moving water. He was laying the intake manifold for his atmospheric engine. He understood a geological principle that most surface dwellers overlook. The Earth is the ultimate thermal flywheel. The desert surface experiences wild temperature swings, baking at 150 degrees in direct sun and dropping to 80 at night. But soil is an excellent insulator. As you descend deeper, the daily temperature variations flatten out. By the time you get 10 or 12 feet down, the seasonal lag dominates. The soil at that depth has no idea it's June. It is still retaining the thermal memory of February. In the Arizona Territory, at a depth of 12 feet, the soil temperature holds steady at approximately 65 degrees Fahrenheit all year long. It is an endless reservoir of cool mass, impervious to the sun. He laid sections of vitrified clay pipe, the standard culverts used for road drainage, into these deep trenches. His choice of material was a deliberate engineering decision. Metal pipes, the common choice for plumbing, would have been a catastrophe. Metal conducts heat too readily and reacts poorly with moisture. Had he used steel, the condensation that naturally forms when hot air meets cold surfaces would have rusted out the entire system in a single season. Wood would have rotted and buckled under the weight of the backfill. But vitrified clay is essentially man-made stone. It is fired at extreme temperatures until it becomes glass-like and non-porous. It has a high thermal mass and moderate conductivity. This meant the pipes themselves would cool to the temperature of the surrounding earth and maintain that temperature. They became an extension of the ground itself. The length of the run, 150 feet, was a calculated figure, not an arbitrary one. Air moves with speed. If the tube is too short, the hot surface air being drawn in doesn't have enough time to release its heat to the earth. It requires sufficient dwell time. As the searing 115-degree air was pulled into the far end of the pipe, it started its journey through the cool underworld. It tumbled along the clay walls. Through simple conduction, the heat energy in the air was transferred into the clay, and from the clay into the boundless heat sink of the surrounding soil. Foot by foot, the air shed its energy. By the time it had traveled 50 feet, its temperature had dropped by 20 degrees. At 100 feet, it was nearing equilibrium with the soil. By the time it reached the elbow joint beneath his cabin floor, that air had forgotten it was ever in a desert. It was 65 degrees, crisp and refreshing. But cooling hot air introduces a secondary challenge: water. Hot air can hold a great deal of moisture. Cold air cannot. As the intake air cooled rapidly within the buried tubes, it would wring out its humidity like a saturated sponge. Condensation would form on the interior surfaces of the pipes. If that water were allowed to pool, it would transform the cooling tubes into a swamp. Mold would flourish. The air entering the house would carry a smell of rot and could be filled with spores. It would be a cooling system that slowly sickened its occupants. So, the engineer applied the discipline of the mine shaft. He sloped the entire 150-foot run away from the house, establishing a 2-degree grade. He constructed a dry well at the far intake end, a pit filled with gravel, designed to capture the weeping condensate and allow it to drain harmlessly back into the water table. The tubes would stay dry, self-cleaning, and hygienic. He then buried his work. He backfilled the trenches, tamping the soil down firmly to ensure good thermal contact with the clay pipes. To an outside observer, the yard once again looked like empty scrubland. But beneath the surface, he had installed the lungs of his house. He had connected his living room to the eternal winter of the subterranean earth. However, a lung cannot breathe on its own. It requires a diaphragm. It needs a muscle to pull the air inward. The cooling tubes were just passive pottery buried in the dirt. Without a force to drag the air through them, they were useless. That is why he needed the Black Tower. The tubes were the supply. The chimney was the demand. The construction of the tower commenced with a material that the desert offered in great quantity: basalt. This was not a random choice dictated by scarcity. It was a deliberate selection based on thermal characteristics. Basalt is volcanic rock, born from the Earth's own internal furnace. It is dense, heavy, and naturally dark in color. It possesses a high specific heat capacity, which means it can absorb a massive amount of energy. He collected these jagged, heavy stones from the surrounding scrubland, hauling them to the site by hand. He mortared them together not into a delicate spire, but into a thick, powerful column. But raw stone, even dark stone, reflects a surprising amount of solar radiation. To the naked eye, a rock might look gray or brown. To a physicist, that gray is simply reflected light, energy that is bouncing off the surface instead of performing work. He could not afford to waste a single photon, so he mixed a slurry of carbon black and oil, a primitive yet highly effective solar coating, and painted the masonry. He transformed the gray basalt into a void. When you looked at it, it did not shine. It swallowed the light. This ensured that when the sun struck the tower, the energy didn't bounce. It was absorbed, converting instantly from light into heat, soaking into the surface of the stone and the air immediately beside it. However, a black wall exposed to the open air has its limits. As it heats up, the wind strips that heat away. Convection cools the surface, robbing the engine of its power. To address this, he introduced an innovation that, to his neighbors, seemed like the pinnacle of foolishness. He installed a sheet of glass. On the south-facing side of the chimney, the face that would stare directly into the eye of the midday sun, he mounted a glazing panel, spaced just 4 inches off the black stone surface. The neighbors scoffed. Why would you put a window on a chimney? Why cover a black wall with glass? They were missing the invisible physics at work. The glass acted as a radiation check valve. Solar energy arrives in the form of shortwave radiation. This high-frequency light passes through glass as if it were not there. It strikes the black stone behind the glass and is absorbed. The stone heats up and attempts to re-radiate that energy back out. But here is the trick. Stone re-radiates energy as long-wave infrared heat. And glass is opaque to long-wave radiation. The heat hits the back of the glass and is reflected back to the stone. It is trapped. This is the greenhouse effect, weaponized. By trapping the air between the glass and the black stone, he created a superheated column. While the outside air might be 110 degrees, the air confined behind that glass, unable to escape the wind and baked by the trapped radiation, would skyrocket to 160 or 170 degrees. This massive temperature spike was the turbocharger for his vacuum pump. The hotter that air became, the more violently it sought to rise. But there was a risk in creating a tower of fire attached to your home. If that heat were to bleed sideways, through the masonry and into the cabin, he would simply be building a furnace connected to his bedroom. He had to ensure the heat went up, not inward. He built a thermal break, a layer of insulation between the chimney structure and the living quarters. He used a double layer of adobe brick with an air gap filled with sawdust and lime, creating a firewall. The chimney could be raging with heat, vibrating with thermal energy, but the wall touching the house would remain cool. The heat was strictly confined within the vertical shaft, disciplined to move in only one direction, up. Finally, there was the consideration of height. Why 25 feet? Why construct a tower that loomed over the small cabin like a factory smokestack? The answer is found in the equation for the stack effect. The pressure difference created by a chimney is governed by two variables, the temperature difference and the height of the column. You can enhance the draft by making the fire hotter, or you can enhance it by making the chimney taller. He did both. Every foot of vertical height added weight to the column of cool air outside, pressing down, and added buoyancy to the column of hot air inside, pushing up. A 10-foot chimney might have produced a gentle drift of air. A 25-foot chimney created a powerful draft. It acted as a force multiplier. By extending the stack well above the roofline, he also positioned the exhaust vent into the faster-moving air currents higher up, using the wind to help siphon air out of the stack, further reducing the pressure. As the structure neared completion, the visual was striking and, to the uninitiated, deeply unsettling. A small, squat stone cabin, huddled low to the ground, was dominated by this looming, black-painted obelisk faced with glittering glass. It looked industrial. It looked alien. And on a 115-degree day in July, watching a man painstakingly paint a stone tower black seemed less like an act of construction and more like a suicide note. The town watched, and they waited for the heat to claim him. They did not realize that while they saw a tower, he had built a machine, and he was just waiting for the sun to turn the key. The chimney was the engine, and the buried pipes were the intake. But an engine is useless if it is connected to a leaking chassis. For this system to function, for the vacuum to actually draw that sweet, cool air from the underground tubes, the cabin itself had to be more than just a shelter. It had to be a sealed pressure vessel. Had he constructed a standard wood frame house, or even a hastily assembled stone shack, the system would have failed instantly. A typical house breathes. It has gaps beneath the doors, cracks around the window frames, and permeability in its walls. In a normal home, that is just a draft. In a vacuum-driven cooling system, that is a catastrophic breach. If the house were not airtight, the immense suction from the solar chimney would simply pull the scorching 115-degree air in through the cracks in the walls. Instead of cooling the house, the chimney would have transformed it into a convection oven, sucking the heat wave directly into the living room. So, he built a fortress. He did not use lumber, and he did not use standard brick. He used the desert's own concrete, caliche. This is a natural, hardened calcium carbonate deposit found beneath the topsoil in the southwest. It is brutal to dig through, but when mixed with water and aggregate, it cures into a material almost as hard as limestone. He constructed the walls of the cabin to be 24 inches thick. This thickness was not for structural support. A 6-inch wall could have held up the roof. The 24 inches were for thermal lag. In the world of thermodynamics, heat does not move instantaneously. It travels through dense material at a specific rate. By building walls 2 feet thick, he was buying himself time. When the sun hammered the exterior of the cabin at noon, that heat began a slow, agonizing crawl through the dense caliche. It would take 12 to 14 hours for the heat to migrate from the outside surface to the inside surface. By the time that heat finally reached the interior, it would be 2 in the morning. The sun would be down, the chimney would stop pulling, and he could simply open the windows to flush the heat out into the cooler night air. The walls were not just a barrier. They were a time machine that delayed the heat until it was no longer a threat. But the greatest enemy of a thermal fortress is a window. A pane of glass has an R value of nearly 0. It is a hole in your thermal armor. To a builder in 1912, a window was for light and a view. To this engineer, a window was a thermal liability. He eliminated them almost entirely. He refused to place a single window on the south or west walls. A west-facing window in Arizona is essentially a radiator. It admits the low, punishing afternoon sun directly into the home. Instead, he installed small, narrow, clear-story windows high up on the north wall only. The north side is the shadowed side. It never receives direct sunlight. By placing them high, he allowed for ambient light without solar gain. And critically, these were not loose, rattling sashes. They were fixed, sealed tight with oakum and tar. The only way air was permitted to enter this house was through the underground tubes. He was dictating the terms of the airflow, refusing to let the chaotic atmosphere of the desert decide where his breeze came from. He added one final, subtle modification to the interior architecture. He lowered the floor. He excavated the interior living space down 2 feet below the grade of the yard. This created a cold sink. Cold air is heavy. It wants to fall. By lowering the floor, he created a basin for the cooled air entering from the tubes to settle in. While any hot air that managed to sneak in would naturally rise to the ceiling to be sucked out by the chimney, the heavy, 65-degree air from the earth tubes would pool at the bottom of the room, exactly where the occupants sat and slept. It was the same principle as a walk-in freezer or a root cellar, but applied to a living room. He was not just cooling the air, he was shaping it, using gravity to keep the comfort zone right at human level. The structure was now complete. It sat in the blinding sun, a squat, thick-walled bunker attached to a towering black obelisk. It had no open windows. It had no moving parts. It used no fuel. It was silent, heavy, and dark. To the neighbors, it looked like a tomb. But the engineer knew it was a machine. All he had to do now was close the heavy door, seal the latch, and wait for the sun to rise and start the engine. The moment of truth did not occur at sunrise. At dawn, the desert air is still relatively cool, and the thermal engine is idling. The real test commenced at 10 in the morning, as the sun climbed high enough to strike the south face of the Black Tower with its full intensity. This was the moment the neighbors anticipated the cabin would transform into an oven. They expected the heat to soak through the stone and radiate inward, but they were thinking in terms of static conduction. They did not understand dynamic flow. As the solar radiation hammered the glass-faced black basalt, the air trapped inside the chimney column began to cook. It did not just warm up, it spiked. Within 30 minutes of direct exposure, the temperature inside the stack shot past 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The air molecules inside that narrow, black throat began to vibrate violently, expanding and pushing apart. The density of the air column plummeted, and because nature demands equilibrium, that light, superheated air had no choice but to rise. It did not drift upward lazily like smoke from a cigarette. It rushed upward. The confined space of the chimney, combined with the extreme heat differential, turned the stack into a thermal cannon. The air shot up the 25-foot shaft and ejected out the top, creating a powerful, continuous updraft. This is where the physics of the house shifted from passive shelter to active machine. As that massive volume of air exited the top of the chimney, it left behind a profound void at the bottom. It created a zone of low pressure inside the cabin that was significantly lower than the atmospheric pressure outside. This is the heart of the system. The chimney was not blowing air, it was sucking. It was trying to implode the house. The cabin, sealed tight by the thick caliche walls and the oakum-packed windows, held its breath against the pressure. The walls did not yield. The windows did not leak. The vacuum had only one place to go. It reached down. The suction extended to the lowest point in the room, to the vents connected to the underground clay pipes. The house began to inhale. 150 feet away, out in the scorching scrubland, the intake vent began to pull. If you had held a handkerchief over the opening, it would have been snapped tight against the grate. The system was now dragging the 115-degree outside air into the mouth of the buried tubes. This was the moment of danger. If the tubes did not work, the engineer was simply sucking a blast furnace into his home. But as that blistering air entered the lungs of the system, the heat exchange began. The air was moving, but it was not moving too fast. The diameter of the pipes was calculated to ensure the airflow was laminar, keeping the air in constant contact with the cool clay walls. The laws of thermodynamics took over. Heat always moves from a hotter object to a cooler one. The 115-degree air rubbed against the 65-degree clay. Instantly, the energy transferred. The clay absorbed the heat and passed it into the infinite mass of the surrounding earth. For the first 50 feet of the run, the air was still warm. But as it traveled deeper into the dark, damp tunnel, the temperature plummeted. It dropped to 90, then 80, then 70. The moisture in the air condensed on the walls and drained away down the slope, naturally dehumidifying the breeze. By the time the air reached the elbow joint beneath the cabin floor, it had been stripped of its aggression. It was no longer desert air. It was cave air. Inside the cabin, the result was a sensory contradiction. Outside, the world was white-hot and dead still. There was no wind, only the shimmering heat haze. But inside, there was a breeze. A steady, silent current of air was flowing up from the floor vents, washing over the living space at a constant 65 degrees. It defied every instinct of the people living in that territory, and the most brilliant part of the mechanics was the throttle. In a standard home, the hotter the sun gets, the more miserable you become. In this house, the hotter the sun got, the faster the engine ran. A hotter sun meant a hotter chimney. A hotter chimney meant a stronger updraft. A stronger updraft meant a more powerful vacuum, which pulled the air through the cooling tubes with greater force. The system self-regulated. The sun was providing the energy to defeat itself. The engineer had built a fan that used no electricity, had no moving parts to wear out, and got stronger exactly when he needed it most. He had not just survived the heat, he had hired it to be his air conditioner. The theory was sound, and the construction was solid, but engineering does not matter until it meets the real world. And the real world arrived in the second week of July. The locals would later call it the Great Scorch. A high-pressure ridge parked itself over the territory and refused to move. The sky turned a bleached, hazy white, stripped of all color by the intensity of the glare. The thermometer on the bank porch in town did not just hit 110 degrees, it climbed to 118, then 120, and finally topped out at 122 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade. At that temperature, the desert ceases to be an ecosystem and starts to be a sterilizer. The birds stopped singing. They huddled in the deepest shade of the mesquite bushes, panting with their beaks open. Lizards, creatures built for heat, buried themselves in the sand. The town fell into a paralyzed silence. No one moved unless they absolutely had to. Work stopped at 10 in the morning. The silence was heavy, broken only by the dry rasp of the wind, which felt less like a breeze and more like the exhaust from a furnace. Inside the standard homes of the neighbors, the situation was becoming desperate. The wooden shacks were uninhabitable, sitting at 115 degrees inside by noon. But even the thick-walled adobe homes, the pride of the local builders, had failed. The heat wave had lasted too long. The thermal mass of the walls was fully saturated. The heat had soaked through the 3 feet of mud brick and was now radiating into the bedrooms with a relentless, oppressive intensity. Indoor temperatures in the best homes in town were hovering at 105 degrees. People were surviving by stripping down to their underclothes and soaking bed sheets in water, draping the wet fabric over their bodies in a desperate attempt to use evaporative cooling on their own skin. But the water warmed up in minutes. Sleep was impossible. Tempers flared. It was a misery so profound that it felt physical, a weight pressing down on the chest. And in the middle of this suffering, the town turned its eyes to the Black Tower. They expected to see the engineer fleeing. They expected to see him dragging a mattress out to the creek bed like everyone else, admitting defeat. But they saw nothing. The cabin sat there, squat and silent. The heavy wooden door was shut tight. To the neighbors, seeing a closed door in 120-degree heat was visceral. It felt like watching someone suffocate. Every instinct they had screamed that you had to open the house, let the air move, catch a breeze. Closing the door was a death sentence. It meant he was trapping the heat inside with him. Rumors began to circulate that he was dead. They assumed he had passed out from heat stroke days ago and was now baking in his own stone oven. But then, a ranch hand riding past early one morning reported something that made no sense. He had seen the engineer step out onto his porch to check the thermometer. The man was not naked. He was not wrapped in a wet sheet. He was wearing a long-sleeved flannel shirt, and he was holding a mug of steaming coffee. The ranch hand said the man looked at the thermometer, shook his head, and then went back inside, pulling the heavy door shut behind him with a solid thud. The town did not believe it. It was a hallucination brought on by the sun. No one drank hot coffee in 122-degree weather. No one wore flannel. It was physically impossible to survive in that black-towered box without ventilation. The skepticism turned into a grim certainty. The neighbors pointed to the chimney itself. "Look," they said, "there's no smoke." In their minds, a chimney was for a fire. If the chimney was working, there should be smoke. But the tower stood stark and empty against the white sky. There was no plume of soot. There was only a strange, shimmering distortion in the air above the stack, a violent rippling of the atmosphere, like the air above a paved road in August. They did not recognize it as the visual signature of high-velocity exhaust. They thought it was just the heat haze of the desert cooking the stone. By the fourth day of the peak heat, the concern shifted to duty. If the man was dead, someone had to go get him before the heat did terrible things to the body. A neighbor named Miller, a skeptic who had been vocal about the idiocy of the black paint, drew the short straw. He did not want to go. The walk to the cabin was only a quarter of a mile, but in that heat, it felt like crossing a kiln. Miller filled a canteen, wrapped a wet bandana around his neck, and stepped off his porch. The heat hit him like a physical blow, drying the moisture in his nose instantly. He walked through the shimmering scrub, his boots kicking up dust that felt hot enough to burn. He watched the black tower as he approached. It looked malignant, a dark monolith absorbing the punishment of the sun. He could feel the radiant heat coming off the ground, coming off the rocks, coming off the tower itself. He reached the front porch of the cabin. It was silent. No sound of movement inside, no open windows, just that heavy, sealed door, looking like the lid of a coffin. Miller wiped the sweat from his eyes, took a breath of the scorching air, and raised his fist to knock. He prepared himself for the smell of death. He prepared himself to find a tragedy. He did not know he was standing on the threshold of a miracle. He reached for the iron latch, and it was hot to the touch. He braced himself, turned the handle, and pushed the door open. When the iron latch clicked and Miller pushed the heavy door inward, he did not just step into a room. He stepped across a thermal border that should not have existed. He had braced himself for the stagnant, suffocating air of a sealed cabin, the kind of dead heat that smells of baked dust and old timber. He expected the smell of a tomb. Instead, he was physically struck by a wall of rushing air, so cold it made him gasp. It hit his face like the blast from an open root cellar in November. It was not just shade. Miller knew what shade felt like. In 122-degree heat, shade is just a slightly dimmer version of hell. This was different. This was conditioned air. It was crisp. It was dry. And most impossibly, it smelled of deep, damp earth and wet clay, a scent that had vanished from the surface of the desert weeks ago. Miller stood frozen in the doorway, the blinding white glare of the afternoon sun burning his back, while his face was bathed in a temperature that belonged to a different season. The sweat that had been pouring down his neck and soaking his shirt suddenly felt icy against his skin. He shivered. It was an involuntary, violent shudder, a physical reaction that seemed impossible in the middle of the Sonoran summer. He stepped inside and pushed the door shut, sealing out the furnace of the world, and the silence of the desert was instantly replaced by a sound he could not place. It was a low, steady hum, a rushing noise like a mechanical fan running at full speed. But there was no electricity here. There was no generator chugging outside, no belts spinning. It was the sound of the house itself breathing. The air was not sitting still. It was moving. A constant, invisible current was sweeping through the room, ruffling the papers on the table. Miller wiped the grit from his eyes and looked at the engineer. The madman was sitting in a leather chair reading a book. He was not slumped over. He was not panting. He was wearing a flannel shirt buttoned to the wrists. He looked up at Miller, who was standing there red-faced, gasping, and dripping with sweat, and calmly asked if he wanted a cup of coffee. Miller could not speak. He stumbled toward the far wall where a simple mercury thermometer hung on a nail. He had to see the number. He knew the reality outside. The bank thermometer in town had read 122 degrees when he left. He squinted at the red line inside the cabin. It hovered steady at 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Miller tapped the glass with a shaking finger. He thought it must be broken. A 47-degree difference? That was not just good construction. That was a violation of physics. In a standard adobe home, a 10-degree drop was considered a miracle. This man had achieved a 47-degree drop with no ice, no power, and a black tower that everyone said would turn the place into an incinerator. How? Miller finally wheezed, turning to the engineer. The chimney. It's black. It's in the sun. It should be cooking us. The engineer stood up and walked to the center of the room. He pointed to the floor vents where the cool air was pouring in. The chimney isn't warming the house, Miller. The chimney is the engine. It's 160 degrees inside that stack right now. That heat is rising so quickly, it's creating a vacuum strong enough to crush this room. And because I sealed everything, the house has to pull air from somewhere else to keep from collapsing. He held his hand over the vent. It's pulling it from the ground. The hotter the sun shines, the faster the engine runs. If a cloud were to pass over, this breeze would die, and we'd get warm. The sun is the only reason you're shivering. Miller sank into a chair, the cold air drying his sweat. He realized the profound mistake the entire town had made. They had spent the month fighting the sun with shade. This man had used the sun as fuel. He had not built a shelter. He had built a machine. Miller told anyone who would listen. He described the cold draft, the thermometer, the impossible comfort. For a brief season, the town was fascinated. A few ranchers dug test trenches. A few masons looked at the basalt with new eyes. But the tragedy of this technology is that it was murdered by convenience. Within 20 years, the electric grid reached the valley, and with it came the compressor. The window air conditioner offered something the Black Tower could not: ease. You did not need to excavate 150 feet of trench. You did not need to haul stone or calculate stack heights. You just bought a metal box, plugged it in, and paid the bill. We traded resilience for a thermostat. We replaced wisdom with horsepower. The Black Tower was abandoned, dismissed as a relic of a harder time, a curiosity for the mad pioneers. But today, the context has shifted. As energy grids strain under the load of millions of AC units and electricity costs skyrocket, architects are looking back at that tower with envy. We see the resurgence of these principles in the earthships of Taos and the passive cooling towers of modern green skyscrapers. We call them earth-air heat exchangers and solar chimneys now, wrapping them in academic language. But the physics is identical. Compare the systems. A modern central air unit is a fragile parasite. It consumes 4 kilowatts of power every hour. It relies on a complex supply chain of refrigerants, capacitors, and microchips. If the grid fails during a heat wave or a single 10-cent fuse blows, a modern home becomes an oven within hours. It has no defense mechanism other than a credit card. The engineer's machine used 0 watts. Its efficiency was infinite. It did not care about the price of coal or the stability of the grid. Its power source was the sun itself. As long as the sun shone and the earth remained cool, the system worked. It had no compressor to seize, no freon to leak, no filters to change. The clay pipes would never rust. The basalt would never degrade. It was a passive machine built of rock and clay that would outlast the civilization that built it. It was the ultimate definition of engineering resilience. This brings us to the final wisdom of the draft. We often try to solve problems with brute force. We fight the heat with energy. We fight the cold with fire. We build structures that ignore the environment, and then we spend fortunes trying to make them habitable. The engineer did not fight. He observed. He practiced a kind of architectural aikido. He took the immense, lethal energy of the sun, the very force that was trying to kill him, and he redirected it. He used the heat to create the vacuum. He used the vacuum to pull the cold. He turned the enemy into the engine. That black tower standing in the desert was not just a survival shelter. It was a proof of concept. It stood there, breathing quietly in the silence of the scorch, a testament to the fact that you do not need to be stronger than nature. You just have to be smarter than your neighbors. I want you to look at your own home today. If the power died tomorrow in the middle of a heat wave, would your house protect you, or would it turn on you? Drop a comment below and let me know if you would trust a passive machine to keep you alive. And if you found this deep dive valuable, hit that like button and subscribe. We have more lost history to uncover. The past is full of answers we've forgotten to use.